Okay, so welcome everyone to the American Irish Historical Society. I'm delighted to have with us Dr. Terry Golway, who most of you will know is a fantastic writer, historian, and journalist. He served as a columnist and editorial board member with the New York Times and was a long-time editor and writer at the New York Observer and Politico. His many publications include Machine Made, Tammany Hall and the Creation of Modern American Politics, Frank and Al, FDR, Al Smith and the Unlikely Alliance that created the modern Democratic Party, and For the Cause of Liberty, 1,000 Years of Ireland's Heroes. But he has many, long interests in Irish America, in politics, of course, and labor unions and the FDNY and all sorts of things. So tonight he's going to talk to us about other contentious conventions, particularly two that were very important in Irish America and kind of showcased Irish America's importance in politics at the time. And so I'm delighted, Terry, to turn it over to you. I'll just spotlight you for everyone, and thank you for taking this time. We did this event live, but it was so interesting that we thought it was worth recording for our posterity and for our archives. So thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to all of you who are tuning in now or 50 years from now. So I've covered a lot of political conventions, and obviously this year in 2024, which is the year that we're taping this, we had two national political conventions, and maybe you missed them. And if you did, you didn't miss anything, because these days, national political conventions are basically television shows, and they're so boring that they don't even show them on regular television anymore. I'm old enough to remember, and maybe you are too, back in the day, 1968, 1972, Walter Cronkite on CBS televising gavel-to-gavel conventions, right? That was a thing. That they would go gavel to gavel, and Walter Cronkite would say, this is a civic exercise. Well, nowadays, of course, the conventions really are just glorified television commercials that are shown on Fox News and MSNBC. It's content, right? Conventions have become content. Well, there was a time when actually conventions mattered. And I'm going to talk about a few of those conventions in which the Irish had a particularly interesting role to play. So let's talk about those right now. Now I've lost my slide.
It's probably just the down arrow.
Oh, there it is. There we are. Yep. So this is right. That cartoon is sort of the stereotype of what the conventions used to be, right? They used to be a bunch of middle-aged, not that there's anything wrong with being middle-aged, I remember that, middle-aged white guys deciding who is going to run for president. Because this is before there were primaries, right? There was generally, the conventions came together to actually choose the candidate, as opposed to now, where the candidate is already chosen by the primary voters. So, yeah, there's a reason why we call them the smoke-filled rooms, because that's where they were chosen, right? But with the advent of primaries, which actually started in the early 20th century, but never didn't really become the decisive factor until the 1950s and 60s. And nowadays, as we know, primaries are where all the action is. So the conventions are really sort of an anticlimax, very much so. But still, I would argue, as somebody who has covered 7 or 8 national political conventions beginning in 1984, I still think they're useful for party members. It's almost a reward to be a delegate nowadays, and you get to party in whatever city for 3 or 4 days. Journalists to come together. And the one thing that does happen at a convention nowadays is that the party passes a platform which states, what they believe in. Except in 2000, when the Republican convention actually chose not to have a platform, frankly, because the wisdom was whatever Donald Trump wants is what we stand for. I mean, that's not a criticism. It's just a statement of fact. Although this year they did have a platform. So anyway, that's what conventions used to be. And we're going to be talking about a few of them, which became really contentious, beginning for our purposes in 1912. And the reason I chose it is A, it was contentious, and B, one of the stars of the show was a founding member of the American Irish Historical Society, Teddy Roosevelt, or Theodore, as he preferred to be called, right? In 1912, Teddy Roosevelt had decided that, you know what, it was a mistake for him to leave the White House in 1909 and hand it over to his successor, William Howard Taft. You know, he was still a young man. Of course, remember, Roosevelt was the youngest president ever. He became president in 1901 when William McKinley was assassinated in Buffalo. I believe he was 42 or 43 at the time, Roosevelt was. So he's, you know, he's still a young man, especially by my standards these days. In 1908, he decides not to run for another term, even though he was eligible, and he turns it over to Taft. Taft disappoints him. And it's a long story about why Taft was a disappointment. They're both Republicans. They both consider themselves to be progressive Republicans, but Roosevelt felt that Taft wasn't progressive enough. Now, I've read some historians who also feel that maybe Taft had cracked down on some of the monopolies, some of the trusts in ways that Roosevelt didn't approve of. But the point being is that Roosevelt's not happy with his successor and decides to challenge him for the Republican nomination for president in 1912. So this is the equivalent of a partisan civil war, right? And you've got two presidents running against each other for the party's nomination: Taft, the incumbent president, and Roosevelt, the former president who wants the nomination again. So Roosevelt challenges him in a few primaries. There were a few back then, and Roosevelt sweeps the board with primaries, but 38 states didn't have primaries. And so therefore, yes, Roosevelt won something like 212 delegates in the primaries to Taft's double digits, but the real action was going to happen in the smoke-filled room at the convention in Chicago. So that's where they go. And, anything can happen at the convention. So there you are, right? So Roosevelt won 9 out of 13 of the primaries. And wow, I was guessing, but I forgot that I actually had the figure there, right? So they go to the smoke-filled rooms, and that's where Taft has all the power, right? So they start wheeling and dealing, and Roosevelt is left out of the hand. And he complains, and this argument may sound familiar to some of you. He says that the process is being rigged. And so that's a scene, by the way, the picture is a scene of the convention in Chicago. So he says, you know what, I'm not going to take, my people are not going to take part in this farce, in this, this rigged system. So they withdraw from the convention. And the nomination is handed to William Howard Taft. And Roosevelt goes on to storms out of the convention and his people. Roosevelt wasn't actually at the convention because candidates didn't do that back then. It wasn't until more recent times, until Franklin Roosevelt actually went to a convention in 1936. Back then, you stayed away because you were above the process, you see, right? So, but Roosevelt sort of orders his people to leave, and they form a new political party called the Progressive Party, or the Bull Moose Party, which was Teddy's preferred name, right? And he then runs an independent party challenge to William Howard Taft. So now you've got two Republicans running in 1912. Former President Taft, former President Roosevelt, incumbent President Taft, and the governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson, who's running on the Democratic line. Now, if you're Woodrow Wilson, you're really happy that Roosevelt decides to emerge from that contentious convention and run on his own, because now the Republican vote is split. And that's exactly what happened. Roosevelt actually finished second in that race. Taft a dismal third. I mean, it was a humiliation for any incumbent president. Imagine that, right? You're the incumbent president and you finish third. But of course, there were two presidents in the race, and then Woodrow Wilson wins, but not by much. but it was only because of that contentious convention and what happened, and the fact that a founding member of the American Irish Historical Society decided to run for president and split the Republican vote, that Woodrow Wilson was elected to the chagrin, as we will see, of many members of the Irish American community who grew to pretty much loathe Woodrow Wilson, even though, we think of Irish Americans back then as sort of being Democrats, but as we're about to see, only some. In 1920, two more contentious conventions, and they really aren't that contentious in terms of partisanship. But what makes them contentious for our purposes is that in 1920, the president of the Irish Republic, Eamon de Valera, born in New York, comes to the United States to personally lobby for American funds for what was going on in Ireland at the time, which is the War of Independence, or the Black and Tan War. And, he's here for 18 months, while the war is underway, he's here drumming up support for the Irish cause. And what better place to do it, he thinks, is to take advantage of the fact that there is a presidential election underway in the United States, and it's an open seat because Woodrow Wilson, who has alienated the Irish community because he would not stand up for Ireland at the Versailles peace negotiations, where he said, right, that America and the Allies had fought for the rights of small nations. And an Irish American delegation went to Versailles and said to Wilson, oh, well, we know of a small nation who would like to be independent. And Wilson said, well, I didn't mean Ireland, right? So they're not happy with Wilson. He's not running for a third term because presidents didn't do that back then, because George Washington didn't run for a third term. So therefore, incumbent presidents never did until Franklin Roosevelt in 1940. And now, as we know, although perhaps one candidate for president may not know this, but presidents are limited to 2 terms, even if they are non-consecutive. But in any case, Wilson is not running for a third term, so it's an open seat. Well, Dev decides, he should get involved. In the meantime, 2 other members of the American Irish Historical Society, John Devoy and Justice Daniel Cohallen, are running a group called the Friends of Irish Freedom. Their papers are in the Society's archives. Decide they're going to be the voice of Ireland. They're going to be the advocates for Ireland because they understand American politics. And Dev didn't see it that way. Dev was basically saying, well, no, I am the face of Ireland, not you, right? So that led to a contentious development between Devoy and Cohallen on one side and De Valera on the other. Now, the thing was, Devoy and Cohallen thought the best chance that Ireland had for a good outcome was with the Republican Party, not the Democratic Party. They had supported several Republicans, California Senator Hiram Johnson, Idaho Senator William Borah. They were pro-Irish freedom. And the Americans didn't see a real caucus for Ireland among the Democratic Party, or at least among the top ranks of the Democratic Party. So Devoy and Cohallen are working the Republican angle, hoping that that convention will pass a resolution of some sort in favor of the Irish freedom struggle. Well, again, De Valera says, well, wait a minute. No, I'm in charge. So he goes to the Republican convention in Chicago and assumes the mantle of president of the Irish Republic and proceeds to piss off most of the delegates and the top people there, who basically are saying, wait a minute, we've been dealing with Devoy and Cohallen all along, and basically, who are you? Right? And he says, well, I'm the president, right? So Devoy and Cohallen behind the scenes had written a resolution for the Republican Party to consider and hopefully pass at their convention, supporting Irish self-determination, whatever that might mean, because they knew that the vaguer the language, the more support you might get. And De Valera said, absolutely not. He introduces his own resolution, which demands that the Republican Party support the Irish Republic, which he's representing. So basically, the delegates are saying, what are we going to do? Which one do we choose? And De Valera is forcing the issue. No, it's my resolution. And Devoy and Cohalan, on the other hand, are sort of saying, don't pay attention to that man. Pay attention to us. So what winds up happening is the convention basically says, or the committee that's considering the resolution says, if you Irish factions can't agree, hard to believe that anything like that happened, right? Then we're not going to get involved, right? De Valera wouldn't accept the wording that Cohalan and Devoy had come up with. De Valera's resolution was defeated, and the Republican convention, which that picture, by the way, is of John Devoy, the Republican convention, which Devoy and Cohalan really thought had been prepared to pass something that supported the Irish cause, they wind up splitting up. They nominate their candidate, Warren Harding, and they leave without any word of support for the Irish struggle. Well, now the next convention is the Democratic Convention in San Francisco, and Cohalan and Devoy, although they didn't have a whole lot of allies in the Democratic Party, because they had antagonized Woodrow Wilson so much. In fact, part of that was because of the work that Cohalan and Devoy had done with the German government in preparation for the Easter Rising in 1916, and they were perceived to be pro-German, which they were until the United States was fighting Germany in 1917. So they didn't have a whole lot of friends with the Wilson administration. De Valera basically says, well, I'm going to go to San Francisco now. And Devoy and Cohalan basically said, good on you. Go ahead. Lots of luck. And he again proceeds to alienate the Democrats, who were not inclined to be sympathetic anyway because of the poor relations between Wilson and the Irish American community. De Valera fails utterly to get any sort of resolution out of the Democrats in support of the Irish freedom cause. So think about this. Now, we always talk about Irish American political power, even this year, which way is the mostly Irish Catholic vote? Which way are they going to go, et cetera? And we know that the Irish Americans rule the American cities from Boston and New York to Baltimore, right? At this time. And yet, neither party at this critical moment in Irish history, with Irish America at least united on the idea that there should be some form of Irish self-determination, neither party goes out on a limb and supports the Irish cause, which in retrospect seems amazing, right? We think not even a pandering resolution, right? Not even something that doesn't mean much, but nope, nothing, not a word. And I think, in my view, it's because of De Valera's bungling. To me, there's not a doubt in my mind. If Devoy and Cohalan had been left to their own devices, the Republican Party, the Republican convention would have supported Irish self-determination. The Democrats then might have felt obliged in some way to match them, because that's how politics works, right? But it didn't happen. The one thing that did come out of 1920, sort of good for Irish America, is Al Smith, who was then in his first term as governor of New York. And Al Smith, of course, was Irish American. He was also half Italian American, but he identified as 100% Irish. His name was placed in nomination for president. It was a token effort. Like, there was no way Al Smith was going to be nominated for president in 1920 because he had only been governor for a year and a half. But that's what they did back then. They nominated multiple people, basically it was like, well, whose back do we want to scratch this year? Okay, let's nominate, Joe Smith for president, and then he disappears after one ballot. So that's what conventions were about. And anyway, Al Smith's name is placed in nomination, which is somewhat historic when we see what happens next. So that's what happened in the 1920s, right? The conventions were not necessarily contentious, only to the extent that Emma de Valera made them contentious. 1924, 100 years ago, the Democratic National Convention is in Madison Square Garden, not the Madison Square Garden that you know, that round circular building on 8th Avenue. And this was by Madison Square, which is where the name comes from, right? Madison Square over at 23rd Street between 4th Avenue and between Madison and Broadway. So it's where the MetLife buildings are. I think that's what occupies that space now. But anyway, Madison Square Garden. The Democrats are meeting there, and the head of Tammany Hall, Charles Francis Murphy, son of a famine immigrant, the head of the Democratic Party in New York, he's got a scheme. This is the year Al Smith will be nominated for president. It's in his home turf, and Smith has been a spectacular governor in New York. Now is the moment. Well, Charlie Murphy died just before the convention, but Smith's candidacy is now being managed by a guy who everybody thought was out of politics, Franklin Roosevelt, who was diagnosed with polio in 1921, and everybody thought he was finished, except Al Smith, who asked him to place his name in nomination and run the convention. That convention in Madison Square Garden, 1924, was the most contentious convention ever. And it was because the Irish and other ethnic groups, ethnic Catholic groups, and Jewish Americans in the Democratic Party refused to nominate a candidate who was supported by the Ku Klux Klan openly. His name was William Gibbs McAdoo. He was Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law and had been Secretary of the Treasury during the Wilson administration. He was not a member of the KKK. I don't actually believe McAdoo was a bigot at all, but he was for prohibition. Al Smith, who you see there, was very much against prohibition. Al Smith spoke for immigrants. 1924 is the year of the infamous Immigration Reform Act, which put quotas on immigrants from basically everywhere in the world except for the UK, Ireland, Norway, Germany, right? That's it. Everybody else, the door's closed. So Smith stood for all of that. He stood for, he was wet, he was in favor of alcohol use. He was a voice for immigrants. He was a voice for Catholics and Jews. He was a voice for urban politics. And those were all of the things the Klan stood against, right? By this point, 1924, the Klan had successfully, sadly, tragically, had oppressed African Americans in the South to the point where they were no longer a threat to the political order. But now they were looking in northern cities and seeing all of these Catholics and Jews getting power, and they wanted to put a stop to that. So they supported this guy, McAdoo. And Smith, in essence, said, I'm running against that. Well, that convention went on for 103 ballots, 2.5 weeks. Day after day, neither Smith nor McAdoo have the 2/3 required to win the nomination. And every day they go back to their headquarters and try and figure out how they might be able to win a few votes here or there. It was absolute chaos. I've read accounts of it where, as you might imagine, there were lots of New Yorkers in the galleries, right? And they're shouting down speakers they don't like. Poor William Jennings Bryan, right, who is the voice of sort of rural democracy, and he's for McAdoo, right? But he's trying to get people to be reasonable. He's shouted down by the people, mostly Irish Americans, in the galleries, right? And a few times they had to clear the garden. There were fist fights on the floor. It was unbelievable. I mean, if you think we live in contentious times now, take a read. read a book called Machine Made or Frank and Al. You can probably get it for 99 cents and see what that convention was like. We would be appalled by that sort of behavior. But think about what the issues were. They were cultural issues, just as we're debating cultural issues today. In fact, it was about immigration, partly, right? It was also about prohibition, but they weren't really arguing economics. They weren't arguing over tariffs, right? They were arguing over cultural issues. And Smith, that man you see, stood for something that lots of other Americans felt threatened by. Now, you might say, well, look, he's just sort of a white guy with a cigar, right? Yeah. But somebody in Kansas, somebody in Oklahoma, somebody in Nevada, looking at that picture of Al Smith, know what that picture said? Catholic, New Yorker. And that was all they had to know. So the convention finally ends on the 103rd ballot when Smith and McAdoo agree on a compromise candidate, a guy called John Davis, who then goes down, to defeat to Calvin Coolidge later on, and Davis sort of disappears. Although I believe he is one of the founders of the law firm that we know today as Davis Polk, but that was John Davis. So that is surely the most contentious convention in American history. Although there was another one involving Al Smith, and that is in 1932. So Smith, as hopefully you know, is nominated for president in 1928, the first Catholic ever nominated for president. He goes down to defeat to Herbert Hoover, which he felt was one of the great tragedies of his life, Smith did, because he lost by such a tremendous amount. He blamed it on his Catholicism, which, as a historian, I just think is not true. I think no Democrat was going to win that election in 1928. That's my dog, sorry. I guess he didn't really like 1928 either. So in 1928, Smith loses and therefore is not the president when the Great Depression happens, which I kind of think might have, been a good thing for Smith. In 32, Franklin Roosevelt is running for president. He has succeeded Al Smith as governor, right? And Smith is thinking, oh, wait a minute, the party owes me, right? I took a flyer in 1928. But now there's this thing called the Depression. It's clear that Herbert Hoover is going to lose to whatever Democrat is nominated. So he announces in February of 1932 that he's going to challenge Franklin Roosevelt for the nomination. But although he says, I'm not going to campaign for it. If you want me, just ask. So it goes to the convention, and there were a few primaries. Smith won a couple, Massachusetts in particular. But again, this is a convention that's going to be decided in the back rooms. And Roosevelt has the most delegates, but you need 2/3. So you've got Al Smith, Frank and Al, Franklin Roosevelt. Al Smith used to call him Frank. I'm sure he's the only one who ever did. And Al Smith running against each other, two governors of New York, right? The Irish are completely divided. Many are with Al Smith, but some of them see FDR as a certain victor. And, to politics, many politicians, winning is what matters, right? You can't do anything if you're a loser. So people like Ed Flynn, who is the son of Irish immigrants, James Farley, from Rockland County, they side with FDR because they think FDR has a much better chance of winning. And they were friendly with Roosevelt and not as friendly with Smith. So the convention starts. It's I think it was in Chicago. And 3 ballots go by and nobody's gotten the 2/3. But back then, if you're the front runner, you've got to show your stuff early on. Otherwise, people decide, wow, maybe so-and-so isn't as strong as we thought. After 3 ballots, you read the contemporary newspapers, they're all saying, you know what? Roosevelt may have topped out. It's sort of like the Mets this year in baseball, right? They got to a certain point, and at the time I'm talking, they seem to have lost their energy. Well, that was the thought with Roosevelt. It's like, okay, this is as good as he's going to do. So maybe Smith, or maybe this other guy named John Garner from Texas. Maybe he's the guy. Well, in the time between the third ballot and the fourth ballot, Ed Flynn and Jim Farley, two Irish guys, two Irish American guys, go to Garner and say, we've got a deal you can't turn down. How about being vice president? Now, what was also interesting going on there is that the head of the California delegation was the newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst, or he was basically in control of it. Hearst hated Al Smith, and Al Smith hated Hearst. Went back years, one of the great feuds of American history in that time period, Smith and Hearst. And Hearst sees an opportunity to put a knife in Al Smith's back. And I often tell my students this: we can talk all we want about politics as an abstraction, but if you don't understand that politics are about personal vendettas, then you don't understand politics, right? None of it makes sense. So Garner says, yes, I will be the vice president. That's very nice. I will now give you Texas, my home state. And Hearst says, oh, wow, here's a chance to really put an end to Al Smith. We'll back Roosevelt now. And that's how Al Smith lost the 1932 Democratic Convention when this deal was done between Franklin Roosevelt and John Garner. Cactus Jack, as they used to call him. So that's what happened there. A tremendously contentious convention, which in another one in which Al Smith played a role, and another one in which he lost. Starting with this 32, starting with the 30s, we start seeing less and less contention at conventions because of the rise of primaries. But my last convention that I'll talk about happens in 1968, which of course is during the more modern period when primaries are really important. In 1968, an Irish American from Minnesota named Eugene McCarthy announces he is going to challenge Lyndon Johnson, the incumbent president, which, people generally don't do. You don't challenge the incumbent president in a primary, or if you do, it's just a token candidacy. But Gene McCarthy was serious because he basically said, it's all about Vietnam, right? The Tet Offensive had happened in the winter, early winter of 1968, February of 1968. So the war seemed like we were losing the war, and McCarthy was the peace candidate. So Johnson and McCarthy face off in the New Hampshire primary, which is, even today is sort of thought of as a test, a really important first test. And Johnson wins it, but not by very much, leading Johnson to reconsider his candidacy. Another Irish American, a New Yorker, sort of, Robert F. Kennedy, President Kennedy's brother, is now a U.S. Senator from New York. He jumps into the race now because he sees Johnson is weak. And then Johnson himself drops out of the race. So now you've got a primary a primary campaign season that looks like it's between these two Irish Americans, Gene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy. And so it goes. And Hubert Humphrey, who was the vice president, enters into the campaign, but he decides he's not going to enter any of the primaries. He's counting on a brokered, what we politicos call a brokered convention, that nobody's going to have enough delegates going into the convention. It'll be decided in the back room, and he as vice president would have an advantage. So McCarthy goes on to win 6 primaries, which, by the way, these days, 6 primaries, you're chopped liver. But back then, 6 primaries meant a lot, right? Kennedy wins 5, and they're neck and neck. And the California primary, which to this day is held in June, when these days, like, why would you even bother? Because usually it's over. But back in 1968, the California primary was really important. It was on either June 5th or June 6th. Of 1968, and Bobby Kennedy wins. Some of you watching may remember him standing in front of the podium at the Ambassador Hotel. He flashes the victory sign or peace sign, and says, you know, it's on to Chicago, which is where the convention is going to be. And those were the last words he ever said, at least publicly. He then goes through the hotel's kitchen, which is not protected as it probably should have been. And as most of you probably know, there's a guy waiting for him named Sirhan, and he shoots Bobby Kennedy in the head, and Kennedy dies the next day. Now there's a contentious convention in Chicago because basically the front runner, even though he doesn't look like the front runner, if you just look at it from analytics point of view, he didn't have the most primary votes, but he's thought of as the front runner because he's Bobby Kennedy. Well, now he's dead. So now the convention is going to be completely brokered, right? The primaries don't matter anymore. McCarthy is in the race, and Hubert Humphrey and George McGovern of South Dakota, who's almost thought of as an afterthought. So the question becomes, who is going to get Bobby Kennedy's votes? And you would have assumed, if you didn't know better, that Bobby Kennedy's would go to Gene McCarthy. And by the way, the picture there is of Gene McCarthy at Bobby Kennedy's funeral mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral. That's Kennedy's casket covered by the American flag. So you would think that, but there was such bad blood between McCarthy and Kennedy that Kennedy's votes, that Kennedy was another peace candidate, Kennedy's votes generally went to Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, who is the vice president of, you know, the war party, so to speak, right? He's Lyndon Johnson's vice president. Some of Kennedy's people went to McGovern, but basically out of that brokered convention comes Hubert Humphrey's nomination. And again, some of you of a certain age, like me, might remember that 1968 was contentious, not only for what was going on inside the convention hall, but also what was going on in the outside the hall, right? And I know I just hit something, but that sort of is really all I've got for you. The 1968 convention probably was the last sort of contentious convention that we'll ever have, unless we decide to do away with primaries, which I think would not be a good idea. But it was contentious only because of tragedy, because of Bobby Kennedy's assassination, right? So the Irish have played a role in a lot of these conventions, as you can tell. They continue to play a role. We continue to play a role in American politics, and lots of people like me are waiting to see how the Irish vote, such that it is, splits in the coming election in November. So with that, I'll turn it over to Elizabeth to see if she's got any questions.
Well, that's just fascinating, Terry. You can, if you like, end your sharing.
Right.
So like there's lots, I think, that is generated from your talk there. One of the things I suppose we could talk about, and particularly when we look at today, I had asked you originally to give this talk way back when before President Biden had pulled out, because I thought we might be going to a brokered convention. You know, I didn't think it was maybe that Kamala was guaranteed to be, an incumbent or the next nominee. So this is where we got the idea, to give this talk. So first of all, let's talk about maybe the media. You were saying Hearst in particular. I think that's a fascinating story. How important at these times was the media? Like, because I suppose we're in such a different media landscape in one way today, because it's a little bit more ubiquitous, but we're more siloed maybe than we were, back in the day. So somebody like Hearst, I suppose, is comparable to a kind of a Fox media, or
right.
like, I mean, a widespread. I don't necessarily mean Fox in terms of right wing or anything, but, so talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, Hearst was a really important political figure in New York and nationally, because he was the Rupert Murdoch of his time, except that Rupert Murdoch has never tried to run for elective office, and Hearst had been a member of Congress from New York. He had tried to run for governor, actually did run for governor and failed. He also wanted to run for U.S. Senate in 1922 from New York, and Al Smith blocked him from doing that. So he had this role that he was he was he was probably not as powerful as Murdoch, but he's the only comparable figure I can think, with the caveat that he actually did get involved in actual elective office. But he had the ability to swing entire delegations as he did with California in 1932, right? He was the man behind the curtain. Uh, Now, what I would say about the media is back when there really were contentious conventions, I mean, it was a media festival. I mean, even in my career, going to the conventions in '84 and '88 and a couple in the '90s, it was fun because actual news was made. For example, in 1988, I remember covering the Republican convention in 1988 in New Orleans, and I think it was the first day of the convention, George H.W. Bush waited until then to announce his vice president, who was this guy that no one, well, most people hadn't heard of, named Dan Quayle, this young senator from Indiana. So now we had a full day of stories. Oh, I remember that. We would, wow, who is this Quayle guy and everything else? But they become so scripted now, Elizabeth, that news organizations don't even bother, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I can't speak for my most recent former news organization, Politico, but my guess is that they may not staff it in ways that they might have even. Politico didn't exist 20 years ago, but we've seen a downgrading of them, and I think that's good because they are such infomercials now that we know we're being manipulated now.
Yeah. Well, I think that was actually something that came out of, in one way, both of the conventions this year. Like, various groups feel very pandered to, by the choice of maybe singer or performer, or like, if this is as much attention as we're getting, but actually you don't work to fix some of our concerns, then what use is it? So I think there is a sense that it's more an entertainment and a spectacle. And so in those days, just in terms of democracy, like if the primaries are less important, who all is in the room at these conventions? Like, who is it? The party machine? Is it representative? Like, who has the power?
Well, back in the glory days, if you will, of sort of Irish American political power, it was a lot of Irish Americans, right? So somebody like Charles Francis Murphy, the head of Tammany Hall, would have been in the smoke-filled room in the teens and 1920. Of course, he was dead in 24, but before then, the heads of the major democratic organizations, the state organizations, particularly powerful governors, would be in the rooms, and they would be trying to sort this out, as they did in 1924. There's a lot of people who not actually, I shouldn't say a lot, because not a lot of historians even care about this, but those of us who do would argue that if Charles Francis Murphy had lived and saw what was going on in the 1924 Democratic Convention, that he might have intervened and said, look, let's just stop. We're literally committing suicide here. Let's figure something out. And he would have had the gravitas to do that because he was Charles Francis Murphy, a man who even his wife called him Mr. Murphy, right? So he had that sort of aura, but he had died, and there was nobody there to basically say, all right, let's stop. The old system was not representative. It was the party bosses, all of whom tended to be white males, and back then, chances are they were Irish Americans. By the same token, those party bosses, I'll tell you something, those party bosses would have never allowed John McCain to nominate Sarah Palin as vice president. They would have said, no, Senator, we love you, but are you kidding me, right? There are very few people around anymore who will say, are you kidding me, on either side, right? And that's why I think the bosses, I think there's an element that's missing for American politics because of something that went away when we decided that bosses were intolerable,
Well, and it's interesting you talk about that actually, because I guess the bosses probably knew, their constituents, they knew what they could and couldn't push, and they knew what would and wouldn't fly. So there maybe is an element, and at the end of the day, like, you're counting votes, like it's a science really, or a math, problem. So as well as a communications, problem, but maybe we are missing that a little bit from politics, that something else has taken over. And so, I know part of the criticism, we'll say, that came out of the 2016 campaign, for example, was, you know, major news networks literally run the entire or filmed the entirety of a Trump rally, you know, and so
Yes.
he gets free press for 3 hours, like uninterrupted. There's no fact checking. There's no nothing. And now they're a bit more cautious of that kind of stuff now, but it still is interesting, you know, how the role of non-judgmental, you know, media has in this, and
Yeah.
without a boss to oversee.
Right.
Yeah.
And the people who were most screwed
Mm.
by the media's obsession with Trump in 2016 were his Republican opponents.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
they were the ones who were saying, well, wait a minute, you know, Chris Christie and others who were
Yeah.
trying, well, Christie dropped out early, but some of the others were basically saying, we're not getting any airtime because you're
Yeah.
putting Trump on for, as you said, 3 hours. And that's
Yeah.
no exaggeration. That's
Yeah.
exactly what happened. But I think the media has learned some of the lessons along the way. But yeah, the media plays a huge role in our political campaigns, and you know, it still does and did back then.
Um, I forget actually, like there was about 18 candidates in those
Yes, it was.
early
Yeah,
primaries.
yes,
I mean, you know, like that. So yeah, to give it all to one, not to mention the other side, you know.
yeah.
Why were you were saying 1928, I think I'm looking for that it was impossible for a Democrat to win in 1928. What was that about?
Well, times were great, right? The roaring 20s, right? The economy was, now what we didn't know is that the economy was about to collapse and that
About
some
to
of the
tank, yeah.
prosperity was a false prosperity. But this is the time of Great Gatsby, right? This
Yeah.
is the time of prosperity for the masses, and everybody and his shoe shiner had money in the stock market. And then it all fell apart. But no one knew that in November of 1928. And by the way, Herbert Hoover was, on paper, a spectacular candidate. I mean, this is the guy who fed and housed the refugees of World War I in Europe anyway. You know, he was a hero.
Hmm.
And he had been a cabinet secretary for the Republican administrations in the 20s. So he really was, you know, we think of him today as the guy who brought on the Depression and this sort of
Hoover
starchy,
Hills.
right, you know,
Yeah.
but he was, Al Smith wasn't going to beat Herbert Hoover. And by
Yeah.
the way, he was orphaned. He had a great backstory too. He
Story.
was
Yeah.
right. He was orphaned, rags to riches, self-made. Oh, he was a terrific candidate on paper.
Hmm. So then, just a last question, because we could talk all day.
Yes.
I wonder, how do you feel, Terry, about politics today? Like, it seems to me to be a little less interesting, a little less intriguing. Has money become, you know, either, you know, the money needed to run a campaign, but also outside interests, you know, we hear things about like APEC and pharmaceutical lobbying and gun control lobbying, and how do we what do you think about the political landscape today, and what's different?
Well, what's different, I think, is that even as recently as the 70s and 80s, and certainly before then, we had narratives, we had great writing about the candidates as people and what they say. And nowadays, you know, the best and the most critical political reporting actually is following the money.
Yeah.
Right. And we need to follow the money. I will tell you, in the spirit of confessional, that one of the things that drove me out of political writing is that I realized that I didn't have a skill set to follow the money, but
Mm.
that was where the important stories were. Um, and I do remember a political consultant whose name is escaping me, but who once said that, you know, there was a famous political journalist named Theodore H. White, who wrote these books called The Making of the President, fill in the blank, right? And like he would literally say, if two candidates were meeting, like, well, what did you have? How was it prepared? Right? Yeah, if they had dinner together. Those days are gone. We don't want that sort of colorful political reporting. We need to know who are the people behind the curtain. And I couldn't make that transition as a journalist, which is one of the reasons why I became a historian.
Yeah, well, I know data is not always fun to sift through, but it is interesting. So thank you very much for that. I think it's fascinating. I'm delighted you brought in all of our American Irish historical people that are involved. And it's so fascinating to think of De Valera, you know, like just the hubris kind of, and the arrogance to come over and think he can just insert himself into American politics like that, against the advice of particularly somebody like Cohalan or Devoy, that knew what they were playing with, you know. That was a huge loss really for For Irish America more
Yes.
than even Ireland, because it does kind of fragment, I think, this Irish American, voting bloc. Have we had an Irish American voting bloc, do you think, since maybe Kennedy, it flashes up every now and then, but is there such a thing today as an Irish American bloc?
I've always felt the answer is no.
Yeah.
And I look in my own family. Half my family votes Republican, half my family votes Democrat. I'm not going to tell you which one I am.
I know, right?
But even in New York, anytime I hear people talking about the Irish vote, I say, what
What
Irish
Irish vote?
vote? Right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I know this is almost heretical among some people, but back in the day when people thought one way to win the Irish vote would be to talk about Northern Ireland. And I always said, well, no, one way to win the Irish vote would be, say, to talk about vouchers for Catholic school students.
Mm-hmm.
That would
Mm-hmm.
have been the 1990s before every Catholic school seemingly, began to disappear. But
Yeah.
I never thought that Northern Ireland was an Irish American issue.
Mm-hmm.
It was among some people, myself
Some people,
included,
yeah.
but it
Yeah.
was not an issue that 33 million Irish Americans cared about.
Yeah. And I think sometimes the Catholicism can be overstated. This
Yes,
idea of if
yes,
you're a one issue voter, abortion may not mean what it means to certain Irish American Catholics,
that's right.
so yeah. So Terry, thank you very much for this. We'll for sure have you back live and in person in the building, but I'm looking forward to doing something. And I know you're working on John Devoy type stuff, so we might have you come in and give a lecture on him someday, just
Great,
because
love
of
to.
the society. Yeah. So thanks very much. I really appreciate it. Okay.